What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Max.
This is Joey.
And on today's episode, as you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about the Seal of Confession and its relationship to the civil authorities, that is the state. But today, we have a guest.
We have a very special guest.
Deacon Harrison Garlick.
Welcome, Deacon. Thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're very excited for this discussion, as always. But before we get into it, I have to give my little spiel.
Of course.
Welcome to Logos Podcast. We're excited that you're here. Thanks for joining us. Max and I are two seminarians studying to be priests in the Roman Catholic Church. And this podcast is all about presenting our audience with the intellectual and spiritual tradition of the Catholic Church, which we think is pretty beautiful.
Yeah.
And which we think can potentially lead you into an encounter with the Logos himself, who is Jesus Christ. So Thanks for being here. If you have been supporting Logos Podcast, you've been following us, and you want to keep doing so, you know you can go to YouTube. We have a website, TikTok, Instagram, all those things. You can also become a supporter of Logos Podcast financially on patreon.com/Logos Podcast. We greatly appreciate all the help that we continue to get from some of our generous patrons. So thank you all. We're praying for our listeners, and we're really glad that you're here.
That's right. And Deacon, we're also glad that you were here. Obviously, we'll let you introduce yourself and tell us as to, why is one of the reasons that this topic interests you, and we'll certainly let you know why we think it's important as the episode goes along. So, Deacon,
First of all, who are you? Where are you from? What's your background? We'd love to hear all that.
Right. No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So, Deacon Harrison Garlick, I am the Chancellor and in-house counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. So we are the eastern half of Oklahoma. So the Oklahoma only has two dioceses. We have the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and they're okay. And then we have the Diocese of Tulsa, the eastern half. And, life is good here. We've got a great bishop, Bishop David Conderla. And I serve as the civil attorney. So I'm the in-house counsel, the general counsel for the diocese. And so in addition to that, I help run our HR, our insurance, child and youth protection, things of that nature. A lot of things that I think people don't immediately think of when they think of running a church or a diocese, but I kind of do more of the infrastructural things and handling risk and things of that nature. On the more important side, husband, father, I have 4 little ones running around. They all just had birthdays, so I think I can do this. It's 8, 5, almost 3, and 1. So we
nice.
had,
wow, so your life is super easy right now.
You're not doing very
just
much.
a walk in the park.
Just a lawyer and just 4 kids and a deacon, and that's pretty chill in your house.
Yeah, I have a very patient wife. That's how this plays out. So I'm a very patient wife. I actually overlapped. Our diaconate program is 6 years. And so I actually started the diaconate program while I was still in law school. So I kind of overlapped them, and I was ordained at 34, so just 2 years ago.
Holy
it's
moly.
we have a few things going on. Live out in rural Oklahoma on 5 acres, so we have somewhere to throw our children when we need to. Right?
Throw children, not frisbees, but your children.
Yes, so they go outside and play, and we've got some ponds, and right now my garage looks like a petting zoo. So I've got we have about 7 ducklings, 2 goslings, and 10 chickens that I created.
Oh my gosh!
So our garage is a little petting zoo right now, and the kids love it. So I'm here in the office, handling, God knows what, and I get little pictures of my kids playing with goslings out in the field. So it's good. It's a good life, and privilege to work for the Diocese of Tulsa.
I got to ask, before we dive into the episode, any crazy chicken stories?
Crazy chicken. Well, I have a very belligerent rooster. His name is Odin, and he is small but mighty. He's like a little soccer ball. He's white, and he mainly attacks children. So he's kind of a cowardly little rooster.
Nice.
So he is his replacement is out in the garage. So we're not quite sure who that's going to be yet, but he has a replacement incoming. So he's going to be made into stock here sometime in the next few months.
Wow.
So,
yeah, long time coming, Odin.
Yeah, he actually for harassing children.
I had a buddy over with his family, and we didn't realize that one of his kids had gone back out in the backyard without an adult. And he went up to the rooster, and the rooster actually jumped up and scratched him. And they actually go for your face, so he actually scratched him.
Oh my goodness!
on above and below his eye. So I had to buy my buddy a beer and apologize profusely for my chicken attacking his child. But other than that,
a beer. Hey, that's a good act of reconciliation.
Good trade-off.
Yeah.
Okay, briefly, I am curious. You said you're 34, and you're also
at 34. Yeah.
Ordained at 34. That's a young age to get ordained a permanent deacon. Like, that's cool. Tell me a little bit about your discernment of that vocation and how that's factored into your life.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I was in law school. So long story short, I was in law school, and I wanted to give more of myself to the church. So before I went to law school, I studied theology at Ave Maria University down in Florida, and received a master's in theology from there. I was not Catholic, actually, when I went. I'm a convert. I actually went to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, if you know anything about that. Oral Roberts and Ave could probably not be on further ends of the spectrum. One more traditional Catholic school and the other one kind of a charismatic Word of Faith Protestant school. So anyway, I'd become interested in the Catholic faith through the relationship of faith and reason, through history, reading early church fathers, a lot of things that are probably pretty common to converts. And so I went down to Ave Maria, studied theology, and then was in law school afterward and teaching RCIA, like volunteering for the church. But I really just wanted to give more of myself to the church, but I did not see what that looked like. And so I did what anyone does. I took my pastor out to a little sports bar and just explained it to him. Just said, here's what's on my heart. Here's the splinter in the back of my mind that won't let me go. That was Monsignor Muggenberg. He's actually now the Bishop of Reno, Nevada, wonderful priest. And he's the one who told me, I would have been 27 at the time, I think. He's the one who told me, he's like, hey, you should discern the diaconate. And I was like, why? I'm not retired. And what does a deacon do? I don't know what this does. So he really encouraged me. And so I joined our program, like I said, in law school at 27. I think we had just had our first child. So again, we stacked a lot of things on top of each other. But it was a very beautiful experience because, like, what I tell people, I'm sure it's a similar thing with seminarians, is, it's not, at the beginning, it's not necessarily whether you feel called to actually be a deacon, but more about whether you feel called to actually enter the program. Like, am I being called to discern? Because I think a lot of guys that came in with preconceived notions of what a deacon is and is not were not very malleable to their formators, right? They had these ideas that were just couldn't flex, I think, to their expectations and what was being asked of them. And so I really, in retrospect, it was very nice of me to enter the program with a very open mind about what it means to be a deacon. And I just loved being back inside a fraternal atmosphere and studying the faith and, reading, the great books and doing things like that. So then my class was ordained in the summer. The bishop can waive, so canon law sets you at 35. The bishop can waive it up to 34. And my class was ordained 6 months before my 34th birthday. So I wasn't able to be ordained with them. And then my bishop, who was very generously ordained me the Saturday after my birthday. So I was ordained Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Shout out La Virgencita.
I was very excited. And it was wonderful because it's 2020, so it's right in the middle of COVID. And at one point, I remember just telling my wife, like, there's a great chance that this ordination might be you, me, and the bishop in a chapel. And, like, that's fine. I've detached. Like, whatever we got to do, we got to do. So it ended up being, in our cathedral with a few people. But it was a very beautiful experience.
That's beautiful. Thank you for those of you guys, of our listeners who don't know, the word deacon comes from the Greek diakonia, which means service. A deacon is a servant in the church. So right. Thank you for your service to the church in this capacity.
I wanted to draw attention to one other thing before we go into the content of this episode. Deacon, you also help out with what's called the Alcuin Institute. Could you just briefly tell us a little bit about the work there? I thought it was very fascinating as I was kind of looking into who you were and, to invite you onto the episode. I saw that, you lead this thing that I was very intrigued by. So I don't know if you just mind introducing it and maybe, motivating others to look into it.
Yeah, no, of course. So, unfortunately, in Oklahoma, we are bereft of any Catholic university. We actually have no Catholic colleges in Oklahoma. We used to have one, St. Gregory's University. I was on the board, and unfortunately, it had to close. But before it had to close, the university had brought in a lot of very good talent and had really tried to kind of reboot the university, very faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition, but just couldn't quite get it off the ground. And so what we did is that we said, hey, why don't we start our own theological institute? Why don't we just hire some of these professors to come on board? We'll run it out of the chancery. And their goal was basically to teach our teachers, for someone to pour life back into our leaders. So a lot of times, as you guys know, people are in the parish. They might, we have people that have been serving in the same volunteer capacity in their rural parish in Oklahoma for, 27 years. And we didn't really have any mechanisms by which we poured life back into them, right? Like, who is actually helping to feed them? And so we started the Alcuin Institute really with this in mind, as actually helping those who actually serve in our parishes. The name Alcuin, comes from Blessed Alcuin of York. He was kind of Charlemagne's right-hand man in rebooting Christian culture in the West. And there's probably, as you can imagine, a lot of parallels between that and where we find ourselves in our culture today, of needing to actually kind of reboot an authentic Catholic culture in the West. And so we kind of took him as our patron. And I think they have a lot, their charism kind of seeps deep into everything they do. So for instance, they don't run a whole lot of maybe what we would call like traditional programs. They don't run screens. They don't try and do a whole lot of that. They actually meet in Socratic circles. So there's not the sage on the stage come and 200 people are together and you get a certificate. It's more of like, hey, why don't 8 or 10 of us who work for the church get together over good drinks, charcuterie boards, etc., talk more in a context of friendship, more in a Socratic context. And one of the reasons we do that is because people teach the way they were taught. And so you got to get used to, if you're going to share the faith, that more Socratic dialogue with people, because that's what's natural. That's what we're put in situations of. If someone asks you a question after Mass about baptism or something, you can't invite them to your lecture next Tuesday that's 45 minutes long, right? Like, you've got to have an answer. And you've also be able to learn how, like, just a rhetorical skill of being able to listen and ask questions and things like that. So they bring, I think, a very particular methodology to it. And then the other thing that they do is they focus on primary sources. So one of the things that we always realized is like, we have catechists that have been catechists for 20 years, or Catholic school teachers who have read an abundance about St. Augustine, but have never actually read St. Augustine. Like, we're not conversant with our actual sources, and we have such a rich treasury in the Catholic Church, this intellectual tradition. So they have a lot of handouts, things they do in which they actually try and habituate people to reading primary texts. And that can be difficult, right? But you do it as a group. You do it in the context of friendship. You do these things. And so I think it's a unique model. It's one that, we're still kind of exploring, the best ways to do things and et cetera. But I think it's having a wonderful impact, and it's been a blessing, to have these PhDs on staff and to watch them be able to step in and help our catechists, help our schools. And there's already been a lot of fruit. We've got one school that's already gone to a classical model, and that went from 80 students to over 200 in less than 3 years, and now it's starting a high school. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of good things going on in Eastern Oklahoma. I'll table the rest of them, but the Alcuin Institute is a good endeavor.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about that. That's awesome. That's really exciting to know that something like that exists. Hopefully that becomes a model for other organizations throughout America, especially. Okay, so without further ado, though, we should get into our topic. So Max and I, this was really Max's idea because he's more conversant with current events than I am, but he approached me and was like, hey, we should do an episode touching on the Seal of Confession. So that's ultimately why we're talking about this. And it's relevant because, and I just have a couple news sources here. So recently, the Seal of Confession came under attack in bills in places like Delaware and Vermont. So here's an article. 2 state legislators are considering ending any legal protections for a priest who learns about sexual abuse in the confessional. In response, Catholic leaders warned that the laws are unconstitutional. They put priests in legal jeopardy and endanger confidentiality with penitents. Let's see. And then there was another one, I think Washington State. Yeah, here's another article from Washington State. Washington State House passes a bill requiring clergy to violate the Seal of Confession. So
And there's been other areas. I mean, throughout the U.S. And now, Deacon, historically, this is not unprecedented in some ways, right? If I'm not mistaken, one of the first cases that I read challenging the seal of confession was in 1813, People versus Phillips. I think that's 1813, maybe 1815. Nevertheless, I think this is not unheard of, but what is unprecedented is the level to which it's happening on a public scale and a lot more frequently. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a fair take. I mean, throughout history, we have whole saints that have entered into their sainthood because they would not violate the seal.
Yeah,
because they
that's
were
true.
Tortured because some king said, you have to tell me what this means, or what they said in X, Y, and Z. And so, no, I think the church has a long, rich history of defending the seal of confession. But it is worth asking, what does this look like in American history, and why all of a sudden do we have half a dozen states that are popping up and attacking it now?
Yeah, and I do think another reason that we're talking about this topic, it's because if you attack the seal of confession, you're also attacking particular civil structures that allow for it. And so kind of undergirding an attack on the seal of confession is also implicative of particular laws that include that, and also particular rights that people have been given in order to enable the sacrament, in order to enable the grace of God ultimately to flow in the world. And so an attempt and an attack on the seal of confession also attacks stability in a lot of ways.
So here's just before we continue, I just want to read this. This is from Bishop Thomas Daly from Washington, and I just want to read this because it's cool. It's encouraging to hear our bishop be brave like this. So Thomas Daly reminded legislators that throughout history, all such attempts by kings, queens, dictators, potentates, and legislators have failed, and that even if passed, clergy will not capitulate. And he said this: I want to assure you that your shepherds, bishops, and priests are committed to keeping the seal of confession, even to the point of going to jail. The sacrament of penance is sacred and will remain that way in the Diocese of Spokane. Okay, so that's the Diocese of Spokane, Washington. So I guess the point of this episode is going to be to kind of outline why that is a reasonable statement from the bishop. Like, why is the seal of confession something that's worth protecting? And then so Max and I are going to kind of talk about that. We're going to talk about what is the seal of confession. Yeah. And then Deacon Garlick is going to help us situate this conversation within the context of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the American civil authority in general. Yeah. And we're going to start asking questions like, like Deacon alluded to there, why is it that the culture of America, that our governmental system seems to want to, take away the freedom of the church to have this protection within its institution?
Is it just the seal of confession that they're attacking here, or is it just confidentiality in general? Kind of where does it come from? And we'll let that conversation ensue as Deacon enters a conversation. But first, let's talk about the seal of confession. What is it, Joey? Yeah,
so briefly. Well, I guess we should say something real quick about what is confession in general for our maybe Protestant listeners, if we have any. Briefly, confession is one of our 7 sacraments. It was instituted by Jesus Christ. So on the day that he rose from the dead, he appeared to his disciples, and he said, as the Father sent me, so I send you. And then he breathed on them, and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained. So Jesus gave his apostles, his first priests, the authority to stand in his person and actually hear and absolve the sins of Christians who would necessarily need to confess them to them if they were going to forgive the sins. That's the logic implicit in that commission. So that's why one of our 7 sacraments is the sacrament of confession, also called the sacrament of penance. And this is a place where people can go, obviously, to approach their priest who, and this is the crux of the issue, the priest is acting in the person of Jesus Christ, as he also does in the Mass. But he's acting in persona Christi, so he stands in the place of Jesus Christ, which is why penitents, people who have committed sins, come before their priest and confess their sins to the priest. And the priest has the power given to him by virtue of his ordination to absolve those sins in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit.
So related to that sacrament would then imply a certain obligation on behalf of the priest to conceal those things shared and the identities of those penitents which come into the confessional.
Right, because if people knew that the priest was going to go blab about what they confessed, they would never come avail themselves of the graces that they can get through that sacrament.
And because it's unlike Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That's and that's like what Joey's alluded to here, right? The priest is standing in persona Christi. So ultimately, his model is the mercy expressed to us by God Himself.
Yeah.
In this man that we call the priest. So
that's why we have the seal of confession. This is the seal of confession is the strict obligation of maintaining silence regarding any matter disclosed by a penitent in the sacrament of confession. The encounter between a penitent and his priest or her priest in the sacrament of confession is supposed to be an encounter between that penitent and God and Jesus Christ. And so there's a strict obligation of secrecy placed upon the priest who is hearing the confessions of his parishioners.
And this secret is so, and this seal really is so robust and so kind of absolutized that it must not be violated
ever,
right? And consequently, the confessor, the canon law writes, consequently the confessor must exercise the greatest care not to betray by word or sign or any other way for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right.
So any reason whatsoever. So this means, and the priest can't even make it known that he, like, if Max came to confession for me, came to me for confession, like if I were a priest, I couldn't even say to somebody else that you came to confession for me.
Right.
Not only can I not reveal your sins, I can't even reveal the fact that you came to me for confession.
Sure.
Right. So that's also bound up in the seal. So now, what does it mean to violate? So how is the seal violated, basically?
Right.
This is a question worth asking, just as we kind of establish these definitions. So there's kind of, in the mind of the church, in the mind of canon law and moral theology, there's a couple different ways you can violate the seal of confession. The first one is directly, right? You can directly say, Max came to me for confession, and he confessed the sin of theft, right?
Yes.
If a priest were to do that, he'd be immediately excommunicated from the church.
Right.
That's how serious that. Not only would it be a grave sin, but he would be excommunicated from the church. So that's a direct violation, which is why priests are not allowed to do that. They just can't do it to protect the sacredness of the sacrament itself. Now, there are also other forms of violation.
Correct.
So, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Sure. So there's direct violations, which is what Joey just discovered, and that's pretty absolute, right, Deacon? Like,
Correct.
If there's an explicit revealing of the sins of the penitent or the identity of the penitent, see you later, excommunicated, and the only one that can lift that excommunication is Rome, right? And so that the punishment resides in Rome. There's also, though, indirect violation, right? And this is, to be completely honest, what this means is still kind of being molded over, because indirect violation simply means, like, if you violate the seal of confession indirectly, right?
Yeah.
It's not required that the penitent and his sin be revealed. It is sufficient that there be a probable danger of this happening, right? So if there's something that may allude to the penitent or that penitent's sins, you would consider that an indirect violation, right? And again, there is a punishment, I should say, that ensues when there is an indirect violation.
Mm-hmm.
Who that punishment who's obligated to enact that punishment would typically be the bishop, or maybe a moderator of the curia in consultation with the bishop in the larger church to carry forth what that means. And that punishment can vary depending on the identity or the sin revealed.
Depending on the gravity
indirect,
of...
Right.
So an example that I found helpful is, let's say a priest says to the parents of a girl who came to him for confession, hey, keep an eye on your child, right, this weekend. Because the girl just confessed that she had been sneaking out of the house.
Yeah.
So he didn't explicitly reveal her sin, but he did give he led them down the path of, like, suspecting a sin, and even that is not allowed. So
Jessica stopped sneaking out of the house is the point. You know what I mean?
That is. Yeah, ultimately. So a possible punishment for that is that a priest could be stripped of his faculties to celebrate Mass, to hear confessions. Still a very serious offense. Priests are not permitted, again, because they're acting in the person of Christ. They're being entrusted with really the deepest wounds that human beings are experiencing and are undergoing, the depths of their hearts and their sinfulness. Because they're entrusted with that information, they are not allowed to reveal any of this. And the sticking point, and what is going to relate ultimately to this conversation, is that's the case even if a very serious crime is confessed.
Correct.
So you just heard in those articles read, people want any confession of sexual abuse to be made known by the priest to the civil authority. But because of the nature of the sacrament of confession and because of the strictness of the seal, even if a crime is confessed in the context of the sacrament, the priest cannot make that known, even were he to be pressed by the civil authority to do so.
Right, and one of the questions becomes that is oftentimes placed is, oh wait, so let's say I go to Father Joey and I confess a crime, and then can Father Joey all of a sudden say, hey Max, as your penance, right? So in this sacrament of confession, there's a penance after the sacrament or part of the sacrament. Hey Max, your penance is to actually turn yourself into the legal authorities for this theft. Can Father Joey do that?
Which means basically saying you're not going to be forgiven until you turn yourself in.
The priest cannot do that.
No.
Right? Because what would it do? It would invoke the breaking of the seal of confession. Why? The person's identity is now revealed, and also the sin is now brought before the public's eyes to know.
Now, that being said, a priest, were he to encounter a situation like that, should, I would think, counsel this person, hey, you should really turn yourself in.
Right.
In justice, you should turn yourself in. And if this person was obstinately refusing to do that, that may be a reason for the priest to refuse to absolve that person of his sins.
Correct.
I don't know, depending on the pastoral situation. But he cannot mandate as the penance for the sacrament itself that person go and turn himself in. It's just something that he should counsel the criminal to do.
Right. And so, Deacon, now in your line of work, as we've laid things out, so we laid out a little bit of the sacrament of confession, the seal of confession, can it be violated? Direct violation, absolutely not. Excommunication, grave sin, by the way. Indirect violation, grave sin, punishable by the proper authorities. But then this question of the crime comes up, if there's a serious crime. And a lot of people have that question. And Deacon, I'm sure in your line of work as a civil lawyer and you yourself being a legal advisor to the bishop of your diocese, I'm sure this has come up at least in question and contention. And yeah, how does that relate to your line of work and your kind of knowledge of the state authority?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. That was a wonderful quick mapping of the seal of confession. I appreciated that. Yeah, so it's certainly something that we're watching and monitoring. I actually just got back from a national conference with 150 other attorneys who work for the church, and this is definitely a topic of discussion. Because what happens is there's a cascading effect. So right now we've got either recently or still ongoing, we have Kentucky, California, Washington State, Delaware, Utah, Virginia, and Vermont that are all doing some variation of trying to chip away at that seal. And what happens is that if anyone starts to get momentum, then there's groups that will share these bills with other legislatures around the country that they think are favorable towards it. And so they try and create this like cascading effect, right, while there's actually momentum. So it's it's certainly something that we are observing. Just a few distinctions, like as we kind of go into the conversation. So, what most people might not know is that when you have certain conversations in your life, those conversations are legally privileged, right? So you can think of a scenario this would come up is like, hey, you get sued in any kind of scenario. You get sued, and someone sends you a subpoena, and they say we need to know everything about this subject. You need to turn over your documents. You have to turn over this. You have to turn over that. Well, there's certain conversations that you have in life that might be privileged, that you could actually say that are legally privileged. You say, hey, no, I'm not going to turn over those documents because I was having a conversation, with my attorney, right? I might say, hey, that's a attorney-client privilege. Like I don't have to turn that over. And so there's this balance in the courts between the asking of documents or the asking of certain things and what kind of privileges you have. And most privileges can be overcome in some way, right? So you have some privilege, like with your doctor, but if the lawsuit's about the medical thing, you can get subpoenaed and get your medical records, right? There are certain things that can be overcome. And so, the one that most people know is that your communications with your attorney are privileged. Because that makes sense, because how can you enter a lawsuit and talk about how to defend the lawsuit or how to press the lawsuit, et cetera, if then everything you're going to say to your attorney becomes part of the lawsuit? So this is like part of my role, right, as working in-house for a diocese, as advising bishop and our teachers, and someone calls me and says, what's this scenario? What do I do? Well, I can help them. I can accompany them and walk them through that without then having to turn around and worry that like all the conversations I had with them then can show up in the court the next day, if that makes sense, right?
Right.
So we have certain things in our life.
In a similar way, Deacon, I would guess like what's it called? Like a psychologist to patient relationship here, right? The confidentiality there can't be just exposed to the public. Is that something like that? Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, so like that would like fall under like medical. So like there'd be a certain privilege there, but then a lot of those privileges can be overcome. Like even the attorney-client one can be overcome if it's being used to propagate some kind of crime, right? You can't use it as a shield to defend some kind of criminal activity. So one of the privileges that we have typically throughout the entire United States is this priest penitent. So it's actually what you guys are talking about is a sacrament, right? A canonical standing that we've talked about. So we actually see something mirrored in the civil law in which basically every state has some type of law that says, hey, if you have a conversation, now see, they have to be a little bit more broad because not everyone's Catholic. So it's like a lot of, and we're typically a Protestant nation, so it's been weird to kind of watch how they have to form these laws to try and capture even like a Protestant context, or even like a Jewish one as well. So, because some will actually mention, if you have someone that's playing the figure of a priest, a minister, a rabbi, etc., and you have confidential conversations with them, those actually have a certain amount of privilege. In the Catholic context, we have a very distinct way of showing when that's occurring, right? Through the sacrament of confession, right? It's very clear cut when that conversation was. It's not like I'm sitting at the coffee shop and being like, well, that was actually a confession scene, right? No, it's like it's very clean cut what this is. Yeah, so, so what ends up happening is what we're seeing around the country now is states are trying different ways to violate that seal. And there's typically two different ways. One is just like a general evidentiary standard. So like if you get sued on something and you have to go to court and you have subpoenas, they can basically take in all your communications, all your records. And so, basically just removing that there's anything special about your communications with your priests, right? That shouldn't be privileged at all. That's more of an extreme view, right? Like there shouldn't be anything privileged there at all, et cetera. Those efforts will probably fall flat because they're so extreme, and they're also going to bring in many other groups who aren't going to want to actually go along with that, right? That they're going to want to retain some type of privilege there. What we mainly see happening around the country, which is, I think, more efficacious for their efforts, and also is more difficult to discuss the nuances of on a PR level, and it's hard to express how much this legislative stuff is actually tied to PR, is every state, I would assume every state, has what they call mandatory reporters. So in Oklahoma, every single adult is a mandatory reporter, which is what it sounds like. You are mandated by law to report. So what are you mandated by law to report? You are mandated by law in Oklahoma, for example, to report if you have knowledge the minor is being abused or neglected, right? So, and this is actually somewhat rare in our American legal system, that I actually have a proactive duty on something that I might not even be involved in. But so for instance, we deal with this all the time. So if we have, a child who comes to school and says something that's troubling about their home life, or they make some kind of statement that we know a 3-year-old should not be making a statement, and we, our teacher, whoever hears that, would be required by Oklahoma law to actually report that, right? To report it to Health and Human Services, right? Our Oklahoma variation of that, and say, hey, this child might be in danger. And then they go off and do an investigation, right? And so everyone in Oklahoma is a mandatory reporter, which is not always the case. Sometimes it's only doctors. Sometimes it's only certain key figures in society that would actually kind of come up against this, right? But here in Oklahoma, it's everybody. So typically what we're seeing around the country with the seal of confession in civil law is they are trying to make priests mandatory reporters for the abuse of minors, including what is said inside the confessional. So you can kind of see some of the PR struggles with this off the bat, because first you have to try and go through the nuances of the sacrament of confession, which if you don't believe in, doesn't actually hold a lot of weight, right? That's a difficult conversation to have. And so they tend to concoct these speculative understandings that, this is happening all the time. People go in and report child abuse to a priest in the confessional, and then the priest is bound and can't actually report it, and et cetera. I don't know of a single case Actually, there's one case that I've seen discussed in which a minor actually did go into the confessional and actually confessed that they were being abused. And that's a really interesting case because some people have tried to use that to say, hey, look, the priest must be a mandatory reporter. Well, why do I even know about this case? Well, I know about it because once the priest heard it, like he talked to the minor, and the minor knew that the priest could not say anything because of sealed confession. And so she found the priest a safe place to finally divulge that information. And then the priest was able to work with the minor, right, until she was able to come out and actually state, like, hey, I'm being abused, and tell the proper authorities, and et cetera. And so it shows the reverse of what I think a lot of people would see as intuitive, that the minor or these people are actually more willing to go and talk to a priest in this setting because they know it's safe and it's not going to trigger certain things. And then the priest, obviously being a good priest, is then going to help that person say, hey, this is what we need to do to help you, but allow that person to lead the way. And anyone who works with victims of abuse know that you really have to work according to their timing, right? You have to meet them where they are. You have to meet them and say, where are you ready to have this conversation? Because, I mean, they're incredibly brave, right, to come forward. It might be a family member, it might be someone else. Whether people are going to believe them, whether they're going to get in trouble, whether their social circles are going to collapse if they come forward. So there's a lot of work like that, say we do in the Diocese of Tulsa, that a lot of good dioceses do around the country, of trying to accompany minors that come forward with abuse, or adults who come back later, right? They might not have, they might come to some comfort to actually come forward when they're in their 20s or 30s. So when we're looking at this, this is kind of what we're getting, is saying, hey, these different laws is saying, hey, you have to be a mandatory reporter. So if you hear about abuse in the confessional, you have to report this, right? That's typically what we're seeing around the country. How we defend it legally, so like, how does this even work inside a civil, like, where do our privileges come from? Why do we even have this privilege inside the confession? Like, how's the sacramental reality map on, right, to the civil law? So, like I said, each state has a law. Those state laws then, however, are typically predicated off our First Amendment, right? So if you think of the First Amendment, right, so the two big ones is that, the federal government is not going to establish a religion, and two, they're not going to prohibit the free exercise of a religion, right? So these are kind of the two main clauses of that First Amendment. And I think we can look at this real fast and say, hey, like, if you mandate a priest has to violate the seal of confession, right, you are violating our religious liberty. You're violating our free exercise, right? We can't actually exercise our religion the way that we want to, the way that actually predates America, because you're trying to create these laws that violate that. And I think that's a good argument. And that's where a lot of these state laws come from, is actually just enshrining that on a state level. Does that make sense? Because sometimes, don't let me drag off into my attorney jargon, and, so you got to call me out every once in a while to make sure.
No, it's good.
Yeah,
okay.
To me that makes sense, because like what we're doing is precisely, and you can maybe get into this, but like the sacrament of confession, in a very real sense, it's like an act of worship. It's analogous to, it's analogous in one way to our celebration of the Eucharist. It's one of our sacraments. So, right. Yeah, it makes sense that to defend the state from encroaching upon that reality, we invoke the First Amendment, which protects our ability to exercise religion freely.
Yeah, and so the religious freedom for the Catholic Church, her worship and her expression of religiosity includes the sacraments, particularly the seal of, or I should say, confession.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say even in like a more robust way, it is a freedom, right, of religion, not just of worship, right? Because then we make these claims for like our hospitals. Because you'll actually see this is a rhetorical thing that people do. They'll actually, if you notice articles and things like this, the Obama administration was really big about this. They start talking about the freedom of worship. And actually what they're trying to do is constrain that religious liberty to like Mass on Sunday. And what they want to say is like, hey, your hospitals, your food pantries for the poor, your orphanage, etc., those aren't worship. So therefore you can't claim your religious liberties over those things. And so, like, as Catholics, obviously, we're going to have a more robust understanding of what religion is, right? Because we have the true religion. And say, no, our religion motivates us to do all of these things and can't be reduced to simply confession or any of these things. I also think free exercise is I think, the more apparent. I do think, however, you can make a good establishment clause. And this one sometimes is counterintuitive to people. But anytime the federal government steps in and starts telling us how we should run our religion. Of course, it's like, hey, you're prohibiting me from exercising my religion. But you can also make the argument of, hey, how are you not establishing your own religion if you're going to come in and start telling Catholics how their sacraments function? Right? So you can actually reverse it too and show that the federal government is impeding on this because it's actually establishing its own religion or establishing its own religious practices.
So it's like it's not only revoking the right of a faith, but it's also establishing in a certain way the parameters of how that faith is to be lived, and its encroachment of particularly so confession in this case.
Yeah, correct. So it's not only just prohibiting the exercise of our true religion, but it's also then kind of propping up some kind of false or pseudo side that they really shouldn't be doing. You see the same thing in recent years. There's been a lot on like the ministerial exemption, where like, can Catholics hire, can Catholic institutions hire teachers that are Catholic and expect them to be Catholic and have to teach the Catholic faith, right? And you kind of see these things of the same thing with seminarians, right? Why is it not discriminatory that we only accept males to enter into seminary? Why can Walmart not be like, we only want male cashiers now, right? Why can they not discriminate, but we can? And so without getting into too many complicated things, the church enjoys a lot of privileges. She enjoys and has those privileges whether the United States government decides to actually acknowledge them or not. But she, has certain privileges, and one of them is that, she has the ability an autonomy of her own governance. You can almost look at the church as a little society that's kind of cut out, that she can actually run her own governance on how a church should function. And one of the major sections of that is that we can choose our own ministers. And that's a weird term for us, because when we think of ministers, we typically think of like holy orders. But legally speaking, ministers are basically anyone that we would expect to live according to the Catholic faith, that are going to then teach the Catholic faith and do anything related to it. So the big court case on this a few years ago was Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was 2 LA teachers that were being held according to ministerial standards. And they argue they're not a minister. And the court, thank God, said, no, you are a minister. And if you are a minister, then the church, we basically have full rights, whether to hire you or terminate you. Like, we set the standard, right? It's not federal, non-discrimination law that sets that standard. It's actually church doctrine. And so the analogy there, too, is like, imagine if you had a teacher who was not living according to the Catholic faith. They're posting things on Facebook. They're doing whatever they want to. They're teaching contrary things. And you as the pastor want to terminate them. Well, if the government says that, no, you can't terminate them, you would say, well, wait, that's a prohibition of my free exercise of religion. Like, this is Catholicism. Like, please butt out. Like, we get to choose who our ministers are. But again, you have that same flip argument of, wait, if the federal government starts telling us who our ministers have to be, then they're also establishing a religion, right? If they're saying, hey, no, you have to keep this teacher, you can't terminate this teacher, or you have to accept this person.
Yeah, it is to me too. I just want to ask, in relationship to the priests, right? So we're talking about teachers, educators, you could add lawyers, doctors, but in relationship to the seal of confession, the priest is then lumped into this minister, right? This category of being a minister of the church. Is that right? And so what he does, including the seal of confession, is that right, Deacon? Does that include?
I think it's part of it, right? The seal of confession is a little bit broader, I think, because one would be, we have the right to choose who our ministers are, and also how they engage in ministry, right? That's part of our rights and obligations. We also have the church autonomy doctrine, as I mentioned, that allows us to actually governance how these things work, right? So we actually have laws, as you guys put out really well, right? We have canons on how the sacrament of confession should actually, be celebrated. And so what we do here is that, so they're kind of chipping away at this, and unfortunately, what they're doing is I would say that they're kind of weaponizing the suffering of abuse victims. So whether abuse victims are connected to the confessional at all doesn't matter, and whether they actually have any stats or anything to show that. But obviously everyone is against children being abused. And so there's a lot of rhetorical gymnastics going on right now to try and paint the confessional as some kind of hotbed in which child abuse is known but now not reported. And so it's a hard conversation, I think, to have in a public square, because, like, as you guys said, you have to have all these conversations at the beginning about what is confession, what do we believe about it, etc. And you really have to kind of stop and think about, why is this confidentiality between priest and penitent actually incredibly important? Why would we want to preserve this? And, what are some other ways that like a priest could help in a situation like that?
Yeah, one argument I've heard is that if a priest, by not making it public, the priest is perhaps allowing a perpetrator of these crimes to assuage his own conscience by coming to the priest for repeated confessions without suffering any consequences from it. But the response to that would be the priest doesn't have to absolve this person's sins, right? So the priest doesn't have to assuage, like he can say, I'm not giving you the absolution because you're clearly not repentant. That's actually part of the necessary makeup of the sacrament, is the penitent actually has to express contrition, and the priest has to be able to judge that this person is truly sorry for his or her sins before he gives them absolution. So a priest can very easily deny that absolution.
Not very easily.
Well, yeah, I guess. But in a situation like this where someone was just coming back and like showing no firm purpose of amendment of their behavior, that would be a clear-cut case for a priest to be like, okay, I'm just not gonna give you absolution.
Or if a perpetrator comes in, or a female perpetrator for that matter comes in and is like, hey, I'm not really sorry, but I'm just going to sit in here, all right, and tell you all of these things because I have to tell somebody. The priest can say, no, I'm not going to absolve you of your sins, or we're not going to continue with this confession until there is contrition on your behalf. Yeah. Right? But in the context of the revelation of the information, it's still in the seal of confession, because the context is such that a revelation of this person's crimes is an encroachment on the penitent or this person's sins and identity, right? So even in the context of that, it's like the context then informs the situation.
Okay, so Deacon, I'm curious. Listening to you talk, you've alluded to a couple, I think, very important factors in this discussion, namely that the church is its own society with its own laws. And I think what a lot of people, when they're thinking about these things, especially in the context of American civil law, I think the fallacy they make thinking logically is considering the American civil system to be a more fundamental reality than the church itself. But actually, as you alluded to, the church had these laws long before America existed. And so I guess related to those 2 points, the fact that the church is this own civilized society, this own society, and that it predates America. Why do you think that, given that fact, there is this push to like encroach upon the church's ability to govern herself? Why do you think that American culture, American law, tends to have an issue with the church, both in the seal of confession, and more broadly speaking, with the other ways the church governs herself?
Because you don't see that same aggressive stance for, let's say, you're probably your own profession as a lawyer to reveal information. Maybe in your own practice you have lawyers that wish you would reveal some information, but you don't have that kind of on a public scale, wishing that information was just everywhere. Or same with a psychologist or psychiatrist, and with a doctor, or now but you do have that aggressive push against the seal of confession to reveal the information shared there. And as you alluded to even in the beginning, saints themselves giving up their lives to defend the seal of confession. St. Thomas More as a prime example of that, right? St. Thomas Becket as well, to kind of illustrate that truth. So why do you think there's such a big push against the seal of confession itself?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons for the antagonisms between our current culture and the seal of confession. So I'll just throw out a thesis and then we can kind of play it out. I think a lot of this actually has to do with liberalism. You guys did an episode on liberalism. I think you guys did a great job introducing it. But I think there are some just very natural antagonisms between liberalism and, say, a reality like the sacrament of confession. So just a little bit of grammatical work as we talk about this, like what does liberalism mean? Where does it come from? Because I think it's easy to equivocate here, right? We're using the same word, but it has different meanings. A lot of people are like, oh, liberalism, that means Democrats. Well, not necessarily, or not only. It also means Republicans, right? So when we talk about liberalism, what do we mean? One way to look at it is, so you have this understanding of man that was basically built up. So you look at like the Greeks and the Hebrews and like throughout the Old Testament, and then you see the incarnation of Christ, and then you see like Augustine and, all the way up to St. Thomas Aquinas. Throughout this whole period, there's a contemplation of the whole. There's a contemplation of man living in an ordered cosmos. And what that means is that man, when he looks to say, how should we order society? How should we, where do our laws come from? What's the source of law? He doesn't really even see himself as as someone who invents law. He's more someone that interprets law and then applies it to his particular, say, society or state or polis. So what I mean by that is, like, if you look at natural law speaks in broad moral principles, like do not murder, right? That we all agree that's a natural principle. You don't have to be a Catholic to understand you're not supposed to murder each other, right? But then what happens is that on the civil law side, the legislatures look at that and say, okay, nature says don't murder, so we come up with felony murder, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter. We particularize it and we apply it to society, right? And this is where our laws came from. And this is where, the church in her wisdom says, listen, this is where we pull our law from. And what this means is that, naturally we're political animals. I don't mean that as pejorative, right? We're social animals. We come together... Right. We come together, we live together inside of society, and like I have a human nature, you have a human nature. There are natural virtues that we share. We're under natural law. We reflect on that natural law, and we can come up with ways to actually live together, right? And ultimately,
Deacon,
yeah, go ahead.
Deacon, if I may, real quick, just to hit this point home, because I think it's so important for maybe people who aren't familiar with the natural law, even language. It's like, okay, so we're saying it's a part of the natural law that we shouldn't murder. And what we mean by that is that's not an imperative, that's not a law that we make up. That's a law that's written into the very fabric of reality by God himself. It's like we are able to examine the world as it exists in its order and intuit and discover the fact that to kill another human being is morally wrong.
And that's like man's unique capacity of reason that we emphasize in our podcast all the time. It's like man is actually able to recognize this already installed in the very, as Jerry said, the fabric of existence of nature and how things kind of come together.
Yeah, and then civil law, as you said, Deacon, at least in this classical understanding, is the particular practical instantiations of this natural law that we've received.
Yeah, and obviously the natural law being here grounded in the eternal law, which exists in the mind of God.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, I failed to mention that I really enjoy the name of your podcast, right? The Logos, right? Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, which is really like the order and reality of, or the order of reality itself, right? Reason itself. And Pope Benedict is huge on this, right? If you read the Regensburg Address, if you read a lot of his writings, right, he talks about that we too have a Logos, and we can look at reality around us with our intellect, and the world around us is knowable. It's intelligible. We can look at it and we can pull out these moral principles about how we should live together, and nature provides that for us. So if you get to liberalism then, and the reason I do a little bit of the back work is just simply because, listen, we're downstream from liberalism, and it conditions a lot of our political imagination that's hard to even point it out sometimes because we're just breathing it. Right? Like we just, these are our core presuppositions that we have. So what liberalism does is it comes along and says, listen, we can't agree actually on a common good. We can't actually agree on what it means to be human. We can't agree on what is the purpose of man. Is it to be a Catholic? Is it to be a Protestant? Is it to be secular? Like we're having all these wars. We can't agree on these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to table this understanding that we observe nature and all these things, and we're just going to create a social contract. We're going to create something that's artificial. And so the three of us, for example, are going to create this social contract. We don't have to agree on what's good. We don't have to agree on what a man is or what the purpose of man is. All we're going to agree is that you can pursue what you think is good, I'll pursue what I think is good, and we'll establish certain rights so we don't step on each other's toes, and we'll all go our separate ways. And so we can kind of live as these atomized individuals, but through this social contract, this kind of artificial veneer on top of reality, we can have a functional society, right?
And this is one of John Locke's kind of contributions, or I should say kind of, major contributions to this liberal mindset, liberal idea, is that what at the highest value of a liberal society is held that you don't infringe upon my construction of goods or rights violently. Right. So what is freedom? It's just to not hurt me.
You can do whatever you want without infringing upon my freedoms.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the problem, for the folks at home, the problem with the whole conversation is that liberalism and really modernity as a whole did not come up with its own terms. It actually took ancient terms, gutted them of their meaning, and then reworked them into something new. And that's what makes these conversations so difficult. So, for instance, you talk about rights. So you can see very quickly why rights language started dominating our politics. Because if we all can pursue our own good, then we have to come up with this very concrete understanding of what rights we have, so we don't infringe upon each other as we're all going different directions. Modernity did not invent rights, but they kind of gutted them and created them into something new. It's the same thing with the good. The understanding of the good was never something that could be atomized and fractured into society. It was always that there was a common good. There was one good that we all actually pursued according to reason. Another one would be freedom. And I think you guys have talked about this before, right? Under the liberal mindset, freedom becomes this plurality of options to satiate my desires, my capacity to pursue what I think is good in life. And the ancients, for the record, that would be slavery, right? Because that would be a slavery to your passions. That would be you're living a bestial life.
And for our listeners, pluralism here is like an abundance of options by which you get to choose. Think about like a farmer's market. Yeah, I think exactly. Or yeah, that's actually better. Think about a Walmart, and you get to choose whatever goods you want. None are better than the others. You just get to choose whichever is you're inclined to purchase today.
Correct. Yeah, and so just radically different understandings of freedom. And I mean, this is why we have a lot of problems like in the American church, because then if we start talking like Jesus set me free, well, what does that mean? Does that mean like he gave me all these options and that I can actually do whatever I want to, and thank you for saving me from sin, now I get to do what I want with my life? Or does it mean that like he allowed me and gave me the grace necessary to enter into a life of self-discipline, to crucify my passions, to pursue what's actually true, good, and beautiful? Same word, radically opposite, different definitions. And so when we look at liberalism, just a little bit more grammatical work, you could say like, well, what about like the founding fathers? I think you guys talked about this last time. What about the founding fathers? And what about these people? They talk about God and nature's God and et cetera. So the real question in liberalism is, does anything actually exist outside the social contract that helps govern man? So we've all created the social contract. It's like any other contract. If we all decide to change a provision, we change the provision, right? If we all get together and vote and say, hey, marriage is not a man and a woman. A marriage is a person and any other person they want to, or multiple people, or whatever. Actually, any relationship you want to call a marriage is now a marriage. Well, in the liberal mindset, there's nothing outside the social contract that would govern that. So if we all vote for it, that's the new marriage. Like that's where law comes from.
And Deacon, and apply to, if you will, apply to the seal of confession, that can also be applied, right? So like, if we all agree that a particular injustice needs to be publicly known and revealed to the authority, such as sexual abuse, such as a crime, a particular crime, if we all agree that this is like the best thing for us, we can say, hey, break the seal of confession, you priest. Church, let it go, because we all have agreed here that this particular injustice needs to be revealed to everybody else. And so that the seal of confession, the sacraments, the power of the church is viewed as one of the goods amidst us. And right now, the particular good we have chosen as a society, as a collective people, is this injustice to be revealed to us right now.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that, so just taking a step back and looking at your example, which I believe is correct, and kind of placing it inside of what's the broader antagonism here, is really that liberalism in its social contract does not acknowledge any kind of authority or power or reality outside the social contract. And so like some of the things that we've said here already of like, hey, the church has certain rights and obligations and realities and the ability to govern herself that predate America and will still be in existence after America. And it's not that we ask the United States government to give us these rights. We ask the government to acknowledge the rights we have. Those two things are very different. That whole mindset is incredibly bizarre to a lot of people, right? Because as you mentioned, what ends up happening is the church and all of her goods just gets assumed into the social contract and flattened, and she's just one group, one provision amongst many. So if we all vote to change something, it should vote. And you actually see it's such a pernicious ideology, and it affects the way we think because we live and breathe in it. All of our media is set up like this. Everything just pulls from this culture because we see this inside the church too, right? People think, hey, if we get enough people to vote or do this or do whatever inside the church, like we need to change church teaching because this is there. So we actually bring these principles inside the church, even on her own governance, and try and run her according to these principles. So when you look at the seal of confession, I think it's a really wonderful example of this broader antagonism, because what we're really claiming here is like, hey, there's an actual sacramental reality that is more real and greater than, any of these civil laws, etc. To the degree that it's not that we're asking you, hey, don't violate or change our rights. It would seem to me that our actual statement is, you as a civil government don't even have the capacity to change this thing, right? You had that wonderful opening line from that bishop, and I think that's the undercurrent of that phrase is like, you can do as you will, try and change it, do whatever. We're not going to obey, because at the end of the day, you actually don't have the capacity to change this thing. It's actually a very similar argument that we make with marriage, right? Regardless of what the federal government says, we know there's a reality on marriage, and that you don't actually have the capacity to change that. And that's one of the things about liberalism is that it's habituated us all to relativism, right? And so everything around us now is a malleable reality. There's nothing in my life that does not conform to my will, right? So if even my own, it used to just be like God, history, nature, reason, like all these things became more and more subject to the human will. And now it's like, well, even science, even my body, everything is malleable to how I want it to be.
And Deacon, in this liberal system here, and again, we're not talking about, again, here just political parties or factions within the political system, right? Liberalism meaning kind of the principles really of a democratic constitutional democracy here. What it does is it kind of claims authority, right? And it sees the church as also claiming authority. And now all of a sudden we have kind of two counter sources of authority. And the church is saying, hey, actually the sacramental reality, the incarnation, the sacraments are more real than, for example, the mercy of God is more real than the gravest unjust act. And how could that be? How could that be? Because we as a liberal society have agreed that this injustice is actually the greatest good.
Yeah, I'm thinking of St. Peter in Acts of the Apostles. I think it's Peter when they're tried by either the Jews or the Roman government, and St. Peter is like, who should we obey, God or man? Right? Well, obviously the answer is God. God is more fundamental. God is more real. In the liberal mindset, though, nothing is more fundamental, more real than the social contract that's been agreed upon. And so, yeah, you can, as in a liberal society, you can have your religion, you can follow God, but only as your own kind of particular individual pursuit within the context of the more fundamental social contract, in such a way that if your pursuit of God becomes an obstacle to the way we want to run our social society, you have to put your following of God on the back burner. Whereas the church is like, no, God is more fundamental. God is more real.
And that's not to deny the civil authorities, obviously, right, or the temporal powers, but that's to, as Deacon, you've kind of alluded to several times now, to order the temporal powers to the divine will, to the divine power, right, and the divine knowledge of God, which is, again, what we've used from time immemorial to kind of structure the world. And when we have the rampant kind of principles of liberalism, autonomy, independency, power struggles, all these things, then all of the sacraments, including the seal of confession, can be contested with, challenged, and thrown in the trash can when we decide that as a society that it's okay to do so. And as you're pointing to, Deacon, I think this is a great tension we find in even just discussing this question. It's like immediately people are like, wait, but we should be able to do what we have decided on, and we decide today that the seal of confession is no bueno,
Right. Yeah, I think that, there's a danger here because liberalism is the whole culture, right? And because we all share and we're all kind of raised, in this atmosphere in which we kind of breathe in these presuppositions of, being individualistic and having this modern concept of freedom. And even like our political parties, right? Like if you talk about the Democrats, they're left liberals. If you talk about the Republicans, they're right liberals. There's I forgot who said it, but there's a joke that, America really loves being extravagant. And one of its best examples is that it has two parties dedicated to the same system, right? And so, to give some leniency there, the conservatives, the right liberals, typically have at least some notion that there's something outside the contract still. Either it's nature or religion. They have some notion that the contract is not simply everything. But then left liberals, progressives tend to they've dropped all that. And all that exists is the social contract. And the real danger here is that the church and her people become tame, right? They kind of they become tame insofar as we even view ourselves in the church as really just being one part of the social contract. And even those mechanisms of socialism can seep into the church on, how do we govern our parish? How do we do this? Well, if you start bringing in an atomized understanding of humanity, modern freedom, etc., your understanding of that is going to be very different than how the church has viewed herself for, say, 2,000 years.
And so the church has a robust tradition of anthropology, of epistemology, that's to say the study of the human mind and how it relates to reality, a theology, a philosophy that informs a great source of literature, as you yourself kind of, heading on with this Alcuin Institute. But all that to say that, like, the church has a robust understanding of man's engagement with reality that liberalism then kind of takes on its own from the Enlightenment as a political structure onward to impose it on others as the only source engage of this level of goods. Yeah,
I think that, if you're kind of, particularly if people are foreign to this conversation, it can be a lot to take in at one time. I think just a quick mapping, is that liberalism leads us to relativism, right? So as soon as we agree that we can have the social contract and we can all pursue our own goods, it's not a big step to then believe there actually is no true good. It's just what we can pursue, right? And because you have to ask yourself, where did relativism come from? Well, it came from this mechanism of thought that one day we basically just woke up and said, it's not that you and I can't agree on a common good in reality. It's that simply that the good doesn't exist. The only good that exists is whatever good I decide, and the social contract has to allow me to pursue it. And, the problem is, and this is, again, where I love your name, we're rational animals. We are made in the image of God. We have an intellect, and our intellect is an appetite for truth. And if you put humans inside a society that no longer believes in truth, that really has no truth, right? Everyone has their own truth. Then it actually deeply affects who we are and how we view ourselves as human. And if that intellect is cut off from being able to engage in truth, then what you get is a rise of despair. And I think you see this in our culture in a very deep way.
I've always said that I think the greatest sin that our society struggle with is acedia or sloth, which is deeply rooted in despair, right? You see the good that you should be doing, you don't do it, and then you fall into sorrow, deep sorrow.
No, I think our culture reflects a very deep despair, even though as much as we praise ourselves and we all have new iPhones and everything's great, and we just keep getting more freedoms that are just going to keep knocking over more ancient boundaries and giving us more freedoms, but then everyone around us is sad. Like, if you look at statistics, like, everyone is upset. The problem is that it doesn't matter what kind of social contract you create. You can't get rid of human nature. You can't get rid of natural law. You can't get rid of God. And to grate against those realities, even if you're praising yourself while you do it, is only going to cause despair. It really is. And I think our whole culture is falling into that.
So, okay, this is all very helpful for me to just, thank you, Deacon, for shedding light on all of this for us. So in your mind, this is the root cause of the antagonisms between the American civil system and something like the Seal of Confession. It's the philosophical presuppositions underlying the American civil system in the first place.
Yeah, religious realities are not actually real, right? Religious realities should be subject to the social contract, and they can be changed, by vote and will. And I think just, we're dealing with people that, you're like, well, we just need to explain the sacrament of confession to them. But it's not a real thing. It's another malleable thing according to the human will, like everything else in society. And so what you're coming is you can use something like the violation of seal of confession to kind of show that, us and our neighbors whom we love and want to convert to Jesus Christ are bringing to the table very different presuppositions on what reality is, what a human being is, what it means to live together. We're constantly looking outside ourselves. We're looking at, we believe in God, we believe in providence that moved through history, we believe God entered into history, we believe that he gave us nature and natural law. There are lots of things that we are given, right, the church, that we can look to outside ourselves and say, how do I live a good life? How can I be happy? But modern man continually looks more and more inward. And so when you try and have these conversations about a real reality like confession, your grammar is so far apart because your presuppositions that you bring to the table are light years away from each other.
And I think, Deacon, one of the reasons we've taken on this project, and I know probably guiding a lot of your own work, has been to try to engage these presuppositions, rightly or wrongly, that are philosophies that then inform the way that they live their lives, right? Challenge their own families, challenging, the way that they see the sacraments, the way that they see religious institutions abroad, the way that they see. And so, Logos Podcast seeks to, engage these presuppositions. And that's why a lot of the times when we're discussing these things, we always try to have kind of a philosophical backing before we enter the discussion. As we're doing, in this very discussion, it's like we can't, the argument to try to make the church, if you will, relevant, whatever that means, again, isn't imposing catechesis or just a catechism or just a Bible on everybody. As good and true as those things are, it seems to me that the battleground is philosophical, right?
Which leads me, Deacon, to, I guess, leading towards the conclusion of this episode, a question I have for you. In your opinion, given the state of affairs, do you think the church should, in order to protect itself, for example, with the example of the seal of confession, do you think the church should play by the rules of the liberal social order? Like, should we be trying to protect the seal of confession by arguing according to First Amendment rights and stuff like that? Or should we be trying to get people to actually see the reality, break their minds outside the liberal order and see the reality of confession itself? So that'd be my first question. Then my second question would be, what do you think is going to actually happen with things like the seal of confession? Do you think we're going to be okay, or do you think the state is eventually going to successfully, or do you think the state is really going to try to make moves to encroach upon it? Yeah,
no, those are good questions. I think that, right now, practically speaking, both, as a church and even as individuals, and going back to Max's statement as well, the mind moves, when we actually educate a human being, we move from grammar to logic to rhetoric. That's how our minds work. And it sounds complicated, but it's not, right? So grammar, we have to know what terms mean. Logic, we want to apply the terms. And then rhetoric, we can talk about them, right? And so I think that these conversations are incredibly important because what we're doing here is we're challenging some of those grammatical presuppositions. Do we even know what we're talking about, right? If we say freedom or the good or even the beautiful, do we even know what we're actually talking about, in a robust, Catholic way? So I appreciate your all's work in kind of dragging those out, because I think that is where a lot of really good work can be done to help people understand the reality of the church, and also then to start to see where we are as a culture and how much work we actually have to do to evangelize those around us. Because you just start to see...
And that it takes time, right? That it takes time, right? YouTube shorts aren't going to cut it.
Right. And that's the problem, right? It's because we're all habituating ourselves to only be able to pay attention for 10 seconds at a time, and then we want to sit down and have a robust conversation. But, the purpose of speech is truth, right? All things are judged good or bad according to their end, and the purpose of speech is truth. And so this is why grammar is so important, and some of the work that you all are doing, and the conversation we've had today, is when you start calling in that grammar, you're hopefully moving your language closer to what reality is, and the closer that your grammar gets to reality, the more you can convey truth. because as Thomas Aquinas reminds us, truth is the conformity of the mind to reality. And that statement right there is completely contrary to what we see in the culture. So I think that, individually, I think that's where a lot of the ministry lies, is calling these things out. As far as like these legal efforts go, what do I foresee? There's going to be a ton of power struggles, a lot. One, because liberalism isn't really going to tolerate an authority outside of it, particularly the more progressive it gets, because it's not going to look outside the social contract for anything else. But also simply, just as an observation, relativism always devolves into power dynamics. Always.
This is one of I think, the insights of Nietzsche, for example, right? If you remove any sort of principle, then what's left is kind of atoms clashing towards each other, and whoever has the power wins.
Correct. So, yeah, he at least could understand, Nietzsche was good insofar as understanding that the modern project really hadn't really done anything. Once it killed God, then everything is permissible, right? And so maybe a more palatable person than Nietzsche would be C.S. Lewis, in his, just slightly.
Fair, that's fair.
In his Abolition of Man, he really calls this out, that under relativism, it's always going to devolve into power dynamics, because if the mind can't share truth with one another, there's no truth to actually even share, then the intellect falls into disuse, and the only thing that's left is the will, and we're just going to clash together. And so, as we kind of have these conversations, and we see these legislative attempts across our society, I think they're going to be contextualized by a lot of power dynamics. And that's how they're going to be seen, is we can force the church to do something. And it's not just about the seal of confession. It's about setting a precedent that the state can tell us how to celebrate a sacrament, or what we can and cannot do. And you look at other countries in which, they're told, hey, you can't say this in your catechesis because it goes against our understanding of the human person, or you can't teach this in your Catholic schools anymore. And so whenever we have these little fights like this, it's never just about the one thing. It's about the entire relationship between the church and the modern society. Because it's a constitutional issue, the states will fight it out. I have no doubt that it will pass in certain states, and probably with lots of praise, not because of any actual care of abuse victims, but because it will be seen as a conquering of the church. And then it's going to go up to the Supreme Court because it's a constitutional issue. And I think right now our Supreme Court would probably, I would guess, they would probably rule in our favor on that, but you never know.
Sure. Yeah. And I think maybe a word of hope in line with what Deacon's saying too. And as we've kind of alluded to and I briefly mentioned throughout the episode, in the church's history, this is not an unprecedented thing. And many of the great saints of the church have stood up to the seal of confession and have, when called to task, defend the sacraments and the goodness that the church was given by God Himself, by God Himself to the church. And so, there is hope. And I think, Deacon, also, if I may make my own remark of what I think will happen, I think one of the things we'll see too is priests stand up to it and defend it. And I think, oh, crap, sorry, alarm. I think priests will stand up to the task, and I think laymen too will defend the sacrament because they've received something that only God can give through the sacrament, a reconciliation. And I think we can have trust that our Lord promised that it would never crumble, yet there will be challenges, there will be attacks and difficulties on the way to heaven. And that's something He did not say He would take away, but rather He would give us the grace to embrace them and unite them to the Holy Cross.
No,
yeah,
I agree.
And I guess something also to keep in mind as well, you alluded, Deacon, to other countries where things are even more strict. I mean, we can at least, despite the flaws of the liberal philosophical presuppositions that were inculcated into here in America, we can at least be grateful that for the time being, we do have a mechanism like the Supreme Court, like we do have a constitution that to a certain extent we can fall back on, and hopefully we'll continue to fall back on to continue to protect the church. Like that in and of itself is a blessing, and we shouldn't, I don't know. Do you agree, Deacon? Or like, are you somewhat thankful for the system, even though it's flawed?
I think that I'm currently reading the Iliad with a group of men at my house on a little thing I call Sunday Great Books. And I think that one thing that the ancients teach us is the beauty of the virtue of piety. And piety in a robust sense in which it's a form of gratitude. I'm very grateful for what I have received. And so we usually say I'm pious towards God because obviously he's given us everything. But the ancients, I was thinking about Hector, he also talks about, the ancients will talk about being pious towards your country and also being pious towards your family. Because you have to realize when you're born, you immediately start benefiting from a common good that you have given nothing to.
Right, exactly.
You've actually even before you're born. And how many years as an adolescent do you have to grow up before you even have a capacity to start to give back to society? And so one of the ancient models of this was piety towards your state, your country, was really born out of gratitude, not demanding what is mine and what I can get out of it, but what can I actually give back? And so that's where my heart really goes when we look at the current society. It's very easy, and I'm guilty of this too, of being too negative about the current structures. But also I think you can still at the same time cultivate a certain piety that I love this country, but my piety then drives me to want to contribute and to make it better. And I think
that's incredibly well said, yeah.
And in any structure, then I'm going to want, my country to engage in actual reality of who a human being is and how we find our law, the honor that we should give to God, and how I should actually treat my neighbor.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I am incredibly thankful for your time, Deacon. I learned a lot today in this episode.
Yep.
I'm inspired by your ministry, both as a deacon and as a lawyer for your diocese and with this institute you've founded. So, again, I want to express my gratitude to you again. Thank you so much for coming on, Max. I don't know if you have any final comments before we give him a chance to say something.
No, again, I echo what Joey's saying. I thank you for your service, Deacon. Thank you for the work you do, both in your own work as a civil lawyer and your service to the church.
And as a father.
And as you kind of briefly mentioned, we said before, right? Like the family is the first school of love, right? It's where we teach. It's where we kind of teach people what their heart is, And I think you helping your own cosmos of a home. Thank you for that, and I think it is a beautiful example of fatherhood, and I think it's something that the world could greatly benefit from. So, anyways, any last remarks, Deacon, before we close on up in this episode?
Yeah, no, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, and thank you for your ministry.
Thank you. So, guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. I know I had a lot of really good insights. Joey had a few. Deacon had a lot of really good insights. And so, talking about hierarchies of good, I'll let you be the judge of that one. Guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope you learned something. And as always, God bless.